apes will inherit the earth.
All right, welcome to Get Geeked, presented by Barnes& and Noble. Today I'm joined by Cullen Bunn, author of Deadpool Roleplays the Marvel Universe, among a great many other things. Cullen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Of course. So we're going to start with some basic grounding in fandom questions. You've written across so many different IP universes, Star Wars, Marvel, Cyberpunk. There's a whole list of things that you've written in, but I want to go back to when you first became sort of ingrained in this world of fandoms in the first place, and what the first story universe you found enjoyment in or found yourself gravitating towards.
Wow. Look, I feel like my life has been surrounded by numerous fandoms. I feel like I'm a fan of a lot of things, especially when I was younger. I rotated through every fandom you can imagine. And it's tough for me to pinpoint like the earliest one, maybe. Maybe Godzilla.
Hmm.
I think I was probably a pretty big fan of Godzilla from a very young age. But at the same time, I was just telling someone the other day, I remember being like years before kindergarten, so very young, and I remember getting a Planet of the Apes playset for my birthday or something, and I thought it was and I was so excited about Planet of the Apes. So it was always, it was Godzilla, Planet of the Apes, famous monsters of filmland. Uh, Star Wars Star Wars became something different. It was when Star Wars hit that it became like that defined like my life for a little while was Star Wars, the wallpaper in the room and the Star Wars bed sheets and Star Wars towels and everything else. So Star Wars was a different level of fandom, but I feel like I was always like a fan of something. Like as a little kid, I went through a Sleepy Hollow fandom. Like I was all in on Sleepy Hollow. Anything that I could anything that could be anything that could exist about Sleepy Hollow, I was into that. But then Star Wars came up and that really shaped things for several years. But it was always comics, I was into all that stuff.
It's funny you mentioned the Planet of the Apes playset because I was thinking of my Star Wars was it for me, and it was those Star Wars micro machines. I didn't realize how many I
Oh,
had until I was an adult, and my parents were like, "You got to come get rid of these." And I saw it was just boxes of them, and I was like, "I was just as into this as I thought I was." So that's
yeah.
good.
Yeah, I was yeah, it's and it didn't end there because there was Star Wars, and then I was also a big Dungeons and Dragons kid, so I was really in on that, and it just I feel like sometimes I feel like what wasn't I a fan of, and I don't know what the answer to that is.
I imagine we'll get back to Dungeons and Dragons as it ties into Marvel, to Deadpool role-playing Marvel Universe. But I want to, when did you start converting that fandom into creativity? Because like I said, you've written across so many universes. When did you start sort of dabbling and telling stories in these universes that you loved?
Very early. I wish I still had it. I remember doing a book I called Attack of the Monsters, and it was a story that I was writing and drawing as a little kid about Godzilla and Mothra and King Kong attacking the United States and how the United States combated these monsters. Um, and then and then even and then like in fifth and sixth grade, I was doing a weekly comic book that I was giving to all my friends as part of our club, and it was an original story to some degree, but it was about my it was my about my friends as superheroes or as like a GI Joe style adventure team, really. But at the same time, it had Garfield was in it and Heathcliff was in it. Anything, all these. It was just I was adding all these things in, so I was doing that, and then I started going to conventions and selling mini comics when I was in eighth and ninth grade. So I was going to conventions and selling mini comics, and so I was always interested in telling stories. It's really something that is baked in with me. I've just always wanted to tell stories. So from very early on.
I was gonna say, getting out there and selling comics in eighth grade, like you were destined for where you are now, it sounds
Yeah,
like.
I have this book that's like my my friend of mine saw it and he said, "Oh, this is your 100 Things to Do Before You Die book." And it's not really, it's just sort of a motivational book that I think of things and I write motivational notes to myself. But tucked in there is a letter I received from a guy named Matt Fizzell, who is a creator I used to go to. I go to conventions and he was selling his own mini comics. And I still have this letter he wrote me back in 1980, 1982, whenever it was. And it was like this really encouraging letter about being, being creative and sticking with it. And that kind of stuff just, I, who knows what would have happened if that letter meant a lot to me. And I was just looking at it today and it is from the early 80s, early 80s.
I love that. It's like your very own superhero origin story. Like
Yeah.
that's the item. Uh,
Yeah.
I want to get into some of the characters you've written, three in particular, Deadpool, Darth Maul, Venom, because I feel like they each have their own sort of complex chaos, this really interesting psychology. What draws you to these characters? I mean, we'll get more into Deadpool specifically later, but I feel like each one of them is just this unhinged brand of chaos, and you do it so well within each of their parameters. So what is it about these characters that draws you into them?
Well, I think a lot of these characters for me, and I write a lot of anti-heroes, and I think they're just more interesting to write because they're a little more unpredictable, and maybe you don't know what's going to happen. Look, in the world, I love heroes in real life. In fiction, I'm an anti-hero guy or a villain guy. I like, um, so I just like that the unpredictability. You can kind of do some things you might not be able to do. Like if you're writing a Captain America story, you kind of know who Captain America is at the at the nougaty center. You know what Captain America is. But with some of these other characters, you may not be able to do. May not know what you're going to get into. Darth Maul. One of the things that was interesting for me with him is depending on what you watch, he's not really well defined. And when I was writing, it wasn't like he was a super well defined character. And I thought there was a lot of potential to explore some of those things. And Deadpool could tell any kind of story with with Deadpool character as the character. And Venom, especially when I was writing Venom when I first took over, it was when Flash Thompson was the host of the Venom symbiote, and I just really liked that version of the character, and I liked telling those stories around that character, and how the chaos, as you put it, and the unpredictability of Venom interplayed with a guy like Flash Thompson, who was this sort of military. He had this military approach to things, and I thought that was an interesting way to play with those two dynamics.
So when you get like, let's say, you get the news, you're writing Darth Maul, what are your first steps to sort of get into the psychology of this character?
Um, so I went back and I watched The Phantom Menace, and I was like, all right, what is, Darth Maul was in The Phantom Menace for all of, I don't know, I mean, really a very small amount of time. But there was something about that character that stuck with people. Inarguably, he was the Boba Fett of Phantom Menace, right? He was the character everybody really, everybody loved Darth Maul, even though he was only in that movie for just a few minutes. And what made that happen? So I really wanted to see that. And so I watched the movie to find what I thought defined Darth Maul as a character. And there's a great scene in the movie where these force fields are coming up and down, and he's fighting the Jedi. And whenever the force field comes down, the Jedi kind of relax. They don't relax, but they go into this almost meditative pose. And Darth Maul, on the other hand, paces back and forth like a caged animal, seething with anger. And I really just liked that concept of his anger and what that might mean. And then I tried to balance it with the concept that he was not allowed, according to Star Wars mythology, he was not allowed to go after the Jedi. So I wanted to see what that would look like. And that moment of him pacing back and forth to me defined his character in numerous ways, and it went down numerous paths. And I knew there were other stories in some of the animated stuff, but that was really what I focused on was that moment, and I tried to think of how that would play with just really what were just little kernels that we were given. The Palpatine says, "Soon we will reveal ourselves," which means they haven't revealed. At this point, no one, I couldn't write a story where he's out, publicly fighting Jedi because that wasn't the case yet. And I think that's the kind of challenge I like with a character like you. I get the character's personality and the challenge of how do you tell a story where I know the rules have been set. He hasn't been revealed. He can't kill a Jedi. How do we tell that story? And that was a lot of fun for me.
As you were describing that scene, Duel of Fates was playing in my head. Like,
Oh
yes,
yeah,
I know, I know exactly what this looks like, and that's so cool though. That it's like that one little nugget of personality grows into so much more. Because in the Clone Wars, we do see a lot more of him. We see
right.
a lot more of, and he does build out into this fascinating character. But that was one of the things that I think was so fascinating about your version of Darth Maul, which was that he's trying to play by the rules while also living his own sort of path. And it's such an interesting dichotomy, which again plays into these characters that I feel like you do so well, and so many people feel like you do so well.
Yeah, I mean, he was consumed by rage, and I mean, he had been trained to hate and be filled with rage, and yet they were all Palpatine was also constraining him. He was
Mhm.
putting these, I mean, which really just fed into it, I'm sure, but that is, that those constraints, I thought make him an interesting character.
Mhm. So let's segue into Deadpool. I could talk about Darth Maul all day, but I told myself just give it a couple minutes. We got to talk about Deadpool. So I want to ask what your first connection with Deadpool was. Like, were you a big fan of his before the opportunity to write him came up, or what was your connection to him?
So I don't want anyone to send me hate mail, but I hated Deadpool before I started writing him. I was not a fan of the character. I didn't like the way the character was portrayed. I was aware of the character because I mean I remember when he first appeared. I mean actually at that time I was kind of not buying comics, but my younger brother was, and so I was reading my younger brother's comics when they came out, and so I remember when Deadpool first appeared and everything. But I just never can. Hate is a strong word, but I never connected with the character and I just didn't connect with many of the stories that were being told with the character. I just don't think it was right. I don't think it was a character that was written for, you're not supposed to like everything. That's okay. Despite my many fandoms, I wasn't supposed to like everything. Um, but Deadpool was also my first couple of jobs at Marvel were Deadpool stories. They were at the time they were really using Deadpool short stories to onboard writers into Marvel and see if they were right to work with the company. So my first couple of stories were Deadpool short stories, like 8 pagers. And the thing I find, and I've found many times now over the years, there's a lot of characters I don't like that once I start writing them, I find out, oh, this is why they're fun. This is why people like them. This is why I like them. And so I wrote a couple of Deadpool short stories, and then I was doing some other things for Marvel, and they called me and asked if I wanted to write a book called Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe. I see it right behind you. Yeah. and and that was it. They just had a title. And I said, "Well, can I do this with the character?" And you can pretty much do whatever you want. And then I really started to appreciate Deadpool because I realized, oh, I can tell any kind of story with this character. He can fit in almost anything. And Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe, I was able to take Deadpool in a completely different direction, a really dark direction. I mean, I think I pitched it to my editors at Marvel. What if Deadpool was like Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees? What if he wasn't, like a Looney Tunes character, but was sort of really dark? And then over the year, and that kind of, that book did very well, and that spawned many other Deadpool books that I've written over the years. And I've really come to at this point, so I like Deadpool now. Just like, I didn't like him in the beginning. And I like a lot of those stories that originally I was like, this character, I don't like that. I like those stories too. So, I became a fan of Deadpool after I started working with him.
That's so interesting that you hated him because I have this rogue theory that writers who hate their characters write them better than when they love their because they're more willing to do stuff to them and they're more willing to get to know them
Well,
almost.
well, I
And
mean, that's not, I don't know that that's necessarily a bad theory because sometimes when you, and this has happened to me, sometimes when you have a huge reverence for a character, you don't want to mess with the things you've loved over the years. And that's something you kind of, when you're writing characters like Deadpool or any Marvel character or a DC character or whatever, you kind of have to break yourself of that habit. You have to not hold things in such a high regard. But so you can still hold them in high regard, but you have to be willing to play with it for a little bit. And
Right.
and yeah, I think definitely writing a book like Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe, which is so different from the way Deadpool had been portrayed up until that point, I thought it definitely helped, shape that you could tell any kind of story, but it also helped teach me it's okay to change things up, to play with expectations, to do things people won't like. I mean,
And I'm glad you brought because I wanted to ask about this specifically. Like, I feel like it's one thing to go into a universe and be like, okay, tell a story in this universe. It's another thing to go into that universe and be told, just kill all the characters, like just kill all the ones that people love. So how did you, how did you approach this story? And were you given rules? I mean, you don't have to give any specifics, but were there rules to what you could and couldn't do within
there
this
were
story?
there were no rules. There were no rules on Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe. Every book you work on is different. The only thing was I was given that title. I mean, that really was the only rule. And I was like, well, if that's what you're going to do, let's do it. So, I knew that it was a alternate reality. It wasn't going to be set in, the main Marvel universe. So there was a little freedom there too. But yeah, there were no rules. It was a So I approached it with gleeful malice towards the Marvel characters, I guess. These characters, which weirdly, I was a Marvel kid, so I love all these characters. So, but I still approached it with gleeful malice to kill those characters off.
Were there any that you were particularly excited to kill?
um, there were. I don't know that there were any characters that I was like, oh, I'm ready to off this character. I've hated them for all time. It was good to see them. But there were some that I was like, oh, I really like the way this death played out. I really like the surprise of it. I really like how Deadpool pulled it off. There were a lot of those, but there weren't any characters in the book that I really like. I was like, oh, I can't wait to just stick it to this character after all these years. All these years, I can finally deal with whatever character it was. I just enjoyed, messing around with it and having fun with it. So there were some deaths that I enjoyed, not necessarily any character I was excited to knock off.
Okay, so then I naturally have to ask, which death did you enjoy the most then?
Oh, um, so and it's terrible. I can't remember exactly how it played out anymore, but there's a moment in it because
Hmm.
There was a Punisher comic way back when Punisher kills the Marvel Universe. So I really was building up to Punisher. I knew there had, and I really liked in the Punisher scene, Deadpool was working with other characters. He was working with Puppet Master to control Punisher, and I liked that twist on it that there was nothing he could do. And then we pull out and we realize Deadpool's created puppets of dozens and dozens of characters that he has used these puppets to knock them off like weird voodoo dolls or something. So I like that. Um, when I did the book, it's an interesting book because it's one of my best-selling Deadpool books. It's also one of the most reviled Deadpool books. People love it or they love to hate it. And and I got a lot of hate mail over Spider-Man and
Hmm.
how Spider-Man was killed. And when we did a another series called Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe Again. And in Deadpool, in the first series, Spider-Man dies in issue 2. And I did take great delight in the second series. The second chapter, issue 2, was he was Deadpool killing all the different versions of Spider-Man. And it was just, I'm like, all right, so all the Spider-Man have to die now. Um, that I did take a little delight in. And that wasn't, I get why, look, and it's weird. I'll say, oh, well, this book's hated. And I was kind of ribbing readers that hated it. But I also get why people might hate it. I mean, these are characters you get invested in these characters. You come to love them. So I don't hold that against anybody. It's if they hated that, their favorite character died. But also I was trying to fulfill the promise. I was trying to fulfill the promise of the title. So
Well, you did. So you touched on this a bit earlier, but how much of what Deadpool already was did you bring into what you were doing with him, and how much were you sort of creating your own version of Deadpool?
well, with that book really kind of took it back to form, like took Deadpool back to formula in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Because Deadpool was really sort of zany and he had multiple voices in his head. He had, several voices that would narrate his stories, and all the voices were cracking one-liners. And that was something that I made a point of destroying in Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe. It wasn't, and what was interesting about that for me is later Deadpool books I wrote, many of them are more humorous. They're Deadpool's a little more of a jokester, but all of that was built from the foundation that I wrote with Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe, where he was not a jokester at all. He was pretty much, he might tell jokes, but they were dark, uncomfortable jokes. So I think a lot of ways, the Deadpool stories I wrote after that, I definitely know that my Deadpool stories they're not as zany, not necessarily. I never embraced full on zany. Sometimes maybe I'd veer into it, but I think my Deadpool was a little darker, a little less of a joke character, really. He still had some of that, but I built all that back from this place of kind of this dark Deadpool that I was writing.
Yes, he's definitely a darker version, but that made him so much fun. Let's segue into Deadpool Roleplays, the Marvel universe, which the title plays off of killing the universe,
Right.
which I just enjoyed so much. So this is not a traditional story, obviously. So can you give us like a brief rundown of what this standalone series
Yeah,
or this?
so
Yeah.
so Marvel has in recent months there's a new role-playing game that came out called Marvel Multiverse, which is where you can go in, you can create new superheroes if you want to, or you can play all your favorite Marvel characters and like Dungeons and Dragons, you can go in and play in adventures starring your favorite Marvel characters. Um, Marvel contacted me when they reached out. They said, "Hey, we're going to be doing a role playing game supplement, and we want to have like a short comic to introduce Deadpool in that supplement." And I was all for it. But because I love role so much, when they called me to ask about doing the comic, I said, "Hey, what are the chances of you just letting me write the adventure too? I'd like to write the whole thing." And surprisingly, they agreed to it. So it starts with a short Deadpool comic where he's building a team of heroes that we're introduced to, and then it is an adventure for the Marvel Multiverse role-playing game. The interesting thing about it, I think, is it's all essentially narrated by Deadpool. So I wanted to do something that even if you weren't going to play the game, you could read this adventure and have a good time with it, because Deadpool's, it's told in sort of this irreverent kind of way, and Deadpool's telling jokes, and Deadpool's philosophies on role-playing games and on the Marvel multiverse and everything else. We kind of were able to dig in a different way and explore sort of a different version of Deadpool. A lot of times role-playing game adventures are very dry because they're telling you they're kind of walking you through what's going to happen in the story. And we definitely walk you through what's going to happen in the story, but we also do it in a way that is very Deadpool. And it was just such a blast to write. It was just a lot of fun.
I was gonna say, I'm glad you brought up how even if you don't play the game, reading it itself, because that's what I didn't play the game, I just read it, and I'm like, this is still fun. Exactly why you said, because Deadpool is telling you how to play this game,
Right.
so it feels like you're playing with Deadpool, even though it's
Yeah,
like,
I mean, Deadpool's like, I mean, the entire book is really narrated like Deadpool's like, "Hey, here I am. I'm going to tell you how to do this. have you ever played? If you've never played a role-playing game before, here's how you're going to do it. But as you can imagine, Deadpool's version of that is a little different than a lot of people, a lot of the versions of a lot of people.
So this is obviously different than the traditional comic book script. Was it challenging to write just straight narration? Was that something? I mean, surely you don't only ever write in scripts, but were there challenges in adapting to this kind of story?
You know, maybe a little bit of, there might have been a little bit of ramping up to do it.
Mm.
But I didn't find it wasn't overly challenging. First of all, I've been reading role-playing games material since I was, very young. And so I had that to draw off of. Writing it in Deadpool's voice actually probably made it a little easier because it was just having fun with it. So it made it a little more fun. Maybe the biggest difficulty would be keeping mindfulness of it's also even though, as much as I say you don't have to play the game to enjoy the book, I had to be mindful of it being a playable game and actually work when if a group of people sit together and run that adventure, it has to work. So I did have to be mindful of that in writing it.
And I was curious about that too, because it's like you said, like there's a lot of utility with Deadpool's narration as well of, okay, but this is seriously how you play the game. Were you like, are you experienced with this game that you knew as you were going through, like this is how it works? Or were you like referencing rule books or what was sort of your process with talking this
I
through?
I was definitely referencing the rule books a lot. I I got all the rule books. I ordered everything and sat down and kind of tried to ingrain myself into the system. The nice thing about it was so when I was right, so let's say, there's a scene where I'm giving statistics for whatever and how it works in the game. I've read the rule books and got into it. Um, but the nice thing is the creator of the Marvel Multiverse game, Matt Forbeck, was also kind of there. So when I did something that wouldn't work in the rules of the game, he was able to say, okay, wait, that doesn't work in the rules of the game. We have to figure out something else. So I did have, uh, someone to lean on when it came to the rules because there's no way I'm going to understand the rules of Marvel Multiverse the way the creator of the system is going to understand those rules. So he was just aware of, and also he's created many role playing games. This was my first, official like role playing adventure. So I had Matt there to if I veered too far into one direction, he was there to help me.
And I have to ask, and I'm sorry if this puts you on the spot, but have you played it? Have you played it as a game?
So I have not. I actually got my copies today. Like I opened, so I've only seen it in physical form today. Now I've been talking to some friends of mine, and we've been talking. They want to play it, and they want me to run it for them. So we've been talking about setting it up and running and playing the game. It would be very different from the usual kind of games I play, but I'm up for it.
As I was reading it in my head, I was like, I bet you'd be the narrator. I mean, it feels only natural. You'd have to be, right?
I'm too much of a control freak to not be a narrator when I play role playing games, but yeah, uh, we've talked about it, and then I think it might be fun to do like I don't like to record them to do like videos of the game and show people what's going on with it. Um, yeah, I mean I'm at some point in the near future I will definitely be playing it, but I have not yet.
Gotcha. Regarding the supporting cast with Deadpool, I'm always curious about that too, because you're given a character, you're given the story. Do you get to pick the supporting cast? Like, did you pick Hitmonkey and Paladin to be there, or were these given to you also?
No, I picked that cast. It
Mm.
was yeah, I and I'm trying to remember how I went about it. They give, I knew that we wanted to keep the adventure in the storyline of the Marvel universe. So they had told me where Deadpool would be and who he'd be working with. So it was Deadpool and Taskmaster working together to do these mercenaries, to build mercenary teams. So I wanted to keep it within that framework, So then I thought it might be interesting if Deadpool has to put a mercenary team together that's not traditional. And one of the things I really wanted to do because of role-playing games, and I think some of the most fun in role-playing games is when you're dealing with characters who are not normally shouldn't, they don't necessarily fit together. A mercenary team, in should probably be, very uniform. They're all very similar. But I wanted characters who were very different, and I wanted to build a very different team. So I picked some characters that I'd written before, like Hitmonkey, and I picked Paladin because he's had experience with Deadpool. Um, I picked Lyra, the She-Hulk, because I wrote that character in some of my early Marvel work, and I love the character. And then I picked Annabelle Riggs and Ren Kimura because those are characters I created when I was writing Fearless Defenders. And it's one of those things I'm always going to incorporate them. If any pitch you see for me for Marvel books, almost certainly I pitch Ren Kimura and Annabelle Riggs in it, and I pitch Mania from my Venom run, and I pitched her for this too. But that was the only one they kind of pulled back on. They said, well, we've got plans in the role playing game world for symbiotes and how they're going to impact it, so we don't want to do too much symbiote stuff in this game.
I love that. I was particularly tickled by Hitmonkey being there because he's a personal favorite of mine.
Well, it's kind of delightful to think of a group of gamers and somebody's playing Hitmonkey. I mean, it's just kind of fun to think about that.
That would be me. That would for
Yeah.
sure be me. So let's get into just some basic general like writing Deadpool questions. Very easy questions, such as what's your favorite part about writing Deadpool?
I think probably it's what I referenced earlier. I like that I can tell almost any kind of Deadpool story. Especially with most of the Deadpool stuff I did was like in an alternate reality. There were different kinds of stories. Deadpool because the Marvel Universe is a very different story from Deadpool Illustrated, which was Deadpool killing the classics of literature. And then, Deadpool or Night of the Living Deadpool is Deadpool in a zombie apocalypse, but it's a very serious zombie apocalypse, and Deadpool's the only sort of goofy character in it. So I just like that there's ways to the way Deadpool interplays with other characters, and you mentioned this chaos factor. There are times you can tell a certain kind of story, and you take Deadpool's like a grenade. Here you go. Let's just blow that all up because you've tossed Deadpool into it.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned there, you've alluded to earlier, is that unpredictability, and that's what I've always loved about Deadpool is when he enters, literally anything could happen.
Right.
And I wonder, does that present any challenges to you? Is it because I feel like there are benefits to having boundaries.
Well, yes, and there are many times that some of these pitches I send in, I get this whoa 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 whoa. Yeah, let's let's cool our jets just a little bit here. Um, I mean, I don't think it spoils anything. I'm working on something now that I think the editor's like, well, I'm not so sure about this. I'm like, well, let's and it's and it's good to have that kind of the voice of reason, and to argue against the voice of reason sometime, and see what you can do. So
So you don't have to get into spoilers, but is that other thing Deadpool related?
I'm not supposed to say, but
That's fine. Okay, gotcha. So we're just about out of time, but I want to also ask, again, you've written across so many universes, but I'm curious if there are any universes or characters that you really want to write that you haven't gotten a chance to yet.
yeah, there's a lot of them. I mean, there's a ton of characters out there that I just think would make great comics, and great Cullen Bunn comics. I'm lucky in that I get to write a lot of creator-owned stuff, so I get to play in those universes I create. I'm lucky in that I have been able to write, at least to some degree, almost all of my favorite Marvel characters and DC characters, even if it's just for a page or a panel. Um, I would, there's a couple of movies that I think would make great comic book franchises. I'm a huge fan of the horror movie franchise Phantasm,
Mm.
and I would love to do comics in the Phantasm universe. Uh, I've never written a Predator or an Alien comic. I think that might be fun. But yeah, there's so many. You could probably sit down and start and say, hey, do you like this, and would you like to do a comic? Do you like this franchise? You know, and I could probably it would probably be a series of yeses, um, because there's just so many that I would love to do.
Presumably, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but presumably you're working on more than one story and more than one universe at the same time. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes.
Is it challenging at all to go from the characters over here and then transition into these characters over here and adjust your voice accordingly?
Sometimes, but it's usually I think I've just over the years I've never worked on just one thing. I'm
Mhm.
always working on many projects. Sometimes I need a little, take a breath or two before you shift to it, from say a Deadpool story to a much more serious kind of story. But I've just conditioned myself to be able to make those shifts. So it doesn't derail me much. And that's probably just because of the way I've worked over the years. I mean, depending on schedules, there might be times where I'm writing a Deadpool story for the first 2 hours of a day, and then I'm writing a dark, serious, horror comic for the next 2 hours. And it's just, in order to, in order to stay on top of things and to actually produce the work, I've just had to condition myself to, no, it's go time. I have to shift gears real quick.
And then last question, obviously Deadpool and Wolverine is out there now. I'm curious, as somebody who has written so many of these characters, do you feel like you in any way enjoy them more having written them, seeing them in other stories?
Maybe, I don't know. I mean, it's nice. Like when I was writing Deadpool, I could read Jerry Duggan's Deadpool and enjoy that story, and not feel like it was, overwhelming mine. Um, the interesting thing is, and I've said this in many places, I like them. By the way, I think Deadpool Wolverine was a great movie. I love the movie. On the comic side of things, though, I have I have sort of a glitch or something. Sometimes when I've written a character for a while, like I wrote Deadpool or I wrote X-Men or Venom, once I'm done writing that character, I have a real hard time reading
Mhm.
stories about that character. I need a lot of time, to build up whatever the next story arc is. It might be great. It's nothing against that storyline. I just can't do it yet. It's like it's a mix of what if the other creators mess it up, but it's also what if the other creators do it much better than I did? It's like this. I get anxious about it. So I typically need a couple of years before I can read. Like when I was done with Venom, I didn't read Venom stories for a couple of years. When I was done with, X-Men, I didn't read X-Men stories for a couple of years. It just because it makes me too anxious. The movies, I didn't have that. I didn't have that level of anxiousness with any of the movies. I can go and enjoy or the shows. I can go and enjoy that. But the comics, I kind of felt like a little, it's a weird mix. I don't want to, and again, and I had to, some people think, oh, you're sour grapes. You don't want to read other people's stories. And it has nothing to do with it because I think the stories are probably great. It's me and being, it's like having a panic attack to read a comic. I better not read that comic for a little bit. I better, the great news is there's thousands of other comics, but, so I just take a little break and then I'll pick them back up and I'll start reading them and I get to catch up and it's awesome.
That makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought of that until you said it, but as you were saying it, I'm like, I could totally understand that. Like that make when you finish a story, you want some distance from that
Yeah.
character, even if they're just sitting there not doing anything, you still need that distance.
Yeah, and I don't typically, I'm not a guy who wants to, with characters like for Marvel or, Lucasfilm, or I don't want to write these characters if I don't. Deadpool may have been an exception, right? I said I didn't like Deadpool beginning, but I did love the Marvel Universe.
Mhm.
So when I write a character, especially if I'm writing that character for a while, I get very invested.
Mhm.
I mean, I get protective of the character. I really, I'm into it. I don't want, and I don't want, usually it's almost never that I'm ready to stop writing those characters. It's always it's always I'd rather stick with it. Um, so yeah, it's just it's I write I write, I love the characters I write, and you get, it's just like when I said readers don't want to see Spider-Man get killed because they love Spider-Man so much. I don't want to see, I just need a little bit.
Yeah, I get that. All right. Is there anything I didn't ask that you want to throw out there? Anything you want to say before we wrap this up?
No, I mean it's I think if people are interested in my work, whether you're familiar with it or not, I do a newsletter that comes out every week that I really dig into who I am, my creative process, my many neuroses, and the things that drive me as a creator. And also it'll keep you right up to date. You will always know what's coming up next and when books are coming out. And all because I work on a lot of different books. So it's a good way of keeping up with me, and it's easy to find because if you go to my website, which is just my name, cullenbunn.com, you can get to all that stuff.
And we'll include a link in the show notes as well. Sounds valuable. I was gonna say because there's so much stuff all the time that it's probably very useful just to be just to be
Yeah,
tapped into the source. All right. Well, Cullen, thank you so much for being here. If I haven't said it enough, Deadpool Roleplays the Marvel Universe is out now, and it taps into the RPG as we talked about. So get out there and get it. And Cullen, thank you again for being here.
thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.